So our behaviors rarely ever conform to a single pattern. For example, let's say that you have 4 essays that you need to write for school, and you just finished essay number 1. Chances are that you are going to take a break before you start up on essay number 2. However, sometimes we don't take breaks in our behavior. And anybody that's ever doom scrolled knows that it is hard to break away because you just want to continuously go to the next, 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 to the next. Hi, my name is Dr. Igor Juricevic, and this is Functional Analysis of Behavior 1. Let's go. All right, so in the last video, we talked about the intermittent schedules of reinforcement. So if you haven't seen that video, I highly recommend go back, check it out. So we're going to be taking a look at the effects of intermittent schedules of reinforcement in this video. So if you haven't already, take a look at the previous video because this is going to build on the concepts that we introduced in that previous video. However, just by way of really quick recap, we're going to talk about Sally the saxophonist who often forgets her saxophone. So her teacher reinforces her every single time she brings that saxophone to practice. And as we saw, typically what we've been dealing with are situations where you perform the behavior, you get reinforced, you don't perform the behavior, you don't get reinforced. However, we are now going to take a look at situations where you perform the behavior and you get reinforced, and then you perform the behavior and you don't get reinforced, and what are the consequences of those intermittent schedules of reinforcement. So Cooper, Heron, and Heward mentioned that insert intermittent schedule here produces a typical pattern of responding with different consistency of performance and rate of response. So what that means is the 4 schedules of intermittent reinforcement that we introduced last video, they each produce a typical pattern of responding with different consistency of performance and different rates of response. And these are the effects of those schedules of reinforcement. So if you take a look at a schedule of reinforcement, if you analyze a schedule of reinforcement that somebody is under, you can predict what pattern of behavior they're going to show. And importantly, conversely, if you see a pattern of behavior, you can then interpret that and infer what schedule of reinforcement is leading to that pattern of behavior. So that's very important for us as behavior analysts. So let's dive in. Let's take a look at what are the behavioral effects of being placed on these different schedules of reinforcement. So we're going to begin with the fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement. So once again, this is a schedule of reinforcement where you are reinforced after performing a certain number of behavioral responses. So for example, in a fixed ratio 2 schedule, you're not reinforced every single time you perform the behavior. You're reinforced every second time you perform the behavior. So we're going to be using a cumulative response curve in order to illustrate the differences between behavior so that we can visually analyze these behaviors. And a cumulative response curve, the way that it works is we got time along the x-axis and we got the number of responses, the cumulative number of responses on the y-axis. And what this means is that across time, as we go across time, every single time we perform a response, that line gets 1 notch higher. And every single time we perform a response, it goes 1 higher, 1 higher, 1 higher. So in this way, we can visually see the rates and patterns of behavior. And we're going to see that as we take a look at our first cumulative response curve here for a fixed ratio schedule. So the features that we have here, we got 3 features in this fixed ratio schedule behavior. So let's start with A. And A is that post-reinforcement pause. So that flat line on the cumulative response curve, that means that across that time, no responses are being made. No response was made to increase that cumulative response curve. Hence, we have no behavior. Hence, this is known as the post-reinforcement pause. So that little notch on the cumulative response curve, that indicates when a reinforcement is released, when a reinforcement is earned. And if you are on a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, once you earn that reinforcement, you take a break. And that is the post-reinforcement pause, and that is one of the features of being on a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement. The next feature of being on a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement is the high rate of response runs that are in this pattern of behavior. So after your post-reinforcement pause, you get back to work and you have a high rate of behavior. that high diagonal line, that very steep diagonal line, that indicates a high rate of behavior. That indicates that over a small amount of time, you did a whole bunch of behaviors. And that again is another characteristic of this fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement. And then the last feature of this, and we alluded to this earlier, C, is that the reinforcer is delivered upon the emission of the nth response. In this example, it would be upon delivery of the second response, or it's delivered after the second response. So that little notch, that indicates when things are reinforced. And as you can see, the height between the notches is exactly the same because this is a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, meaning you need the same number of behaviors before you earn that reinforcement. So if you were to see this graph, if you were to see this cumulative response curve, and you weren't told anything about the subject or about their lives or about even what this behavior is, as soon as you see this pattern, A, post-reinforcement pause, B, high rate of response runs, C, reinforcer delivered after the emission of a certain number of responses, you could just take a look at this pattern and say, oh, fixed ratio, schedule of reinforcement, that's what this person is being reinforced under. So next we're going to take a look at a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement and its schedule effects. So just to give you a quick reminder, variable ratio means that the ratio part is that you have to perform a certain number of responses. The variable part is that that number of responses changes. So on average, in a variable ratio 2 schedule of reinforcement, you'll get reinforced after every 2 responses, but it's not going to be after every 2 responses every time. Sometimes it'll be after 4, sometimes it'll be after just 1, but on average, it's going to be after 2 responses. But that number that you need to perform in order to get reinforced, that varies. That varies around that average of 2. So what are the effects of this particular schedule of reinforcement? Well, for this one, we have a very different looking cumulative response curve, right? So for this one, we have no post-reinforcement pause. So our first feature is that we have that high steady rate of responding. So feature A is that high steady rate of responding. That curve is really, really steep. This person on this variable ratio schedule will keep performing the response, and they'll keep performing the response at a very, very high rate of response. So that's the first feature, very high rate of response. The second feature we see here is that the reinforcer is delivered upon the emission of the nth response, but it's just on average. So if you take a look at the distance between those reinforcement slashes, if you take a look at the difference between the distance between when those reinforcements were delivered, you'll see that sometimes it's really short, sometimes it's really long. On average, it's a certain amount, but it varies how many responses you need to make before you get reinforced in a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. So once again, we could just take a look at this cumulative frequency graph, and without knowing anything about the subject, without knowing anything about the behavior, without knowing anything about their history, we could take a look at it and say, oh, hey, they're on a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement just because we see that high steady rate of responding, and we see that the reinforcer is delivered on average after a certain number of responses, but that varies across trials. All right, let's take a look at the next one. So now we're going to get into the interval schedules of reinforcement. We're going to start off with that fixed interval schedule of reinforcement, where after reinforcement is delivered for a behavior, the person has to wait a fixed interval, a fixed amount of time. And once that interval elapses, then the first response after the interval expires, that response gets reinforced and the interval starts up again. So what are the consequences of this particular type of intermittent schedule? Well, this one is actually a favorite amongst behavioral analysts because it's just one of the prettier ones. This is known as a scalloped curve, but let's take a look at the features here. So once again, we have the post-reinforcement pause. However, in this case, you can see that the post-reinforcement pause is very much shorter, but then gradually behavior starts occurring again. Gradually, that line is curved. It gets gradually higher and higher and steeper. And that is feature B, that increase in response rate as the interval progresses. So in a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement, once you get reinforced, you stop responding. Once you get reinforced, you stop responding, you take that break, you have that post-reinforcement pause. But as it gets closer to the end of the interval, you start to get a little antsy. You start to get a little anticipation. You start to think, has the interval passed? I don't have my watch. What's going on here? Maybe I should start responding. And you start responding quicker and quicker and quicker and quicker until you get reinforced, that little slash, until you get reinforced. And then you take another break and you wait until that kind of itch starts again. You start saying, well, maybe. And you start responding higher rates until once again you get reinforced. So this is the pattern for a fixed interval scheduled reinforcement. And once again, we're going to do this 2 more times, but once again, you could just take a look at this cumulative frequency graph, and without knowing anything about the subject, without knowing anything about their history, what behavior we're even looking at, you could take a look at this graph and say, this person is on a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement because I see that scalloped pattern of behavior, which is indicative of that fixed interval schedule of reinforcement. And as we can see before we go, all right, there is one last little feature, and that's feature number C. And as you can see, it is a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement because the amount of distance between the reinforcers across the time axis now, that is exactly the same. So the amount of difference between when you got reinforced the first time and when you got reinforced the second time, that is the same as when you get reinforced the second time versus when you get reinforced the third time. That interval doesn't change, hence fixed interval schedule of reinforcement. All right, and then finally we have the variable interval schedule of reinforcement, where once again you have that enforced rest period. You have that enforced interval that you do not get reinforced during that interval. However, the first response after the interval expires gets reinforced, restarts the interval. The key here now is that that interval is variable. It'll vary around a certain time, in this case 4 hours, but we don't know if it's going to be 4 hours. We don't know if it's going to be 1 hour. We don't know if it's going to be 8 hours. It might even be just 5 minutes. We don't know because it varies around a certain amount of time. So what are the features of this particular schedule of reinforcement? Well, in this case, we have something that looks very similar to the variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. So let's take a look at the features in turn. So feature number A, we have a steady rate of response and few, if any, post-reinforcement pauses. And this is the big difference. So in the variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, that produced a very high rate of responding. For the variable interval schedule of reinforcement, we get a slower rate of responding. In this case, it's more steady with very few, if any, post-reinforcement pauses. So variable ratio will give you a high rate. Variable interval will give you a somewhat lower rate. But they do look very similar. And I'll let you in on a little secret. In the real world, it's a little hard to tell between the two when you're trying to analyze real world behavior. However, for our example here, let's carry on. Feature number B, reinforcer is delivered contingent on the first correct response after the variable interval. So as opposed to the fixed interval pattern of behavior, where the interval was the same every single time between the reinforcements, here you can see that sometimes it's a very small interval between reinforcements. Sometimes it's a much longer interval between reinforcements because that interval is variable, and the first response after the interval expires is what gets reinforced, and that causes this pattern of behavior. So one more time, you could take a look at this cumulative response graph, and even if you didn't know the subject, you didn't know the behavior, you didn't know their history, you could take a look at this and say, you are being reinforced on a variable interval schedule of reinforcement. Maybe a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, but definitely one of those two. And it all depends on what is a high rate of responding versus what is a steady rate of responding for that particular behavior. All right, so that is it for today's video. So once again, we talked about the 4 types of intermittent schedules of reinforcement. We talked about fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable interval. And we took a look at the specific patterns of behavior indicative of each or produced by each schedule of reinforcement. So once again, each of these intermittent schedules of reinforcement makes a very specific pattern of behavior. And as behavior analysts, sometimes we don't know the history of reinforcement for a particular individual, but we can definitely know the pattern of behavior that they're exhibiting. And by using this information here, we can then infer what intermittent schedule of reinforcement their behavior has been reinforced under, what intermittent schedule of reinforcement has maintained their behavior. And that's a very important piece of information to know if we're really going to help people in the real world. So that is it for today's video. Thank you for joining me. Next time, we're going to take a look at stimulus control and the procedures for creating stimulus control and various concepts surrounding stimulus control. But that is it for today's video. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, stay frosty, stay functional. So if you haven't seen that video, I highly recommend go back, check it out. However, it's probably over there. Go back and check it out. No, I think I got it right the first time.